They came to say goodbye, but the house smelled of anything but closure, an expensive floral sting undercut by the metallic tang of rain on the stone steps, the hush interrupted by the occasional cough, the scrape of shoes on oak. On a small table beside the polished casket, under a glass dome of folded paper, rested a single sealed envelope. It looked like the kind of thing meant to be ceremonial, thick, cream, the patriarch's seal still intact. Small and innocuous as paper boat, but heavy enough to capsize everything on the tide. Claire Bennett adjusted the ribbon on a chair, smoothed the crease on a volunteer's jacket, and told herself not to stare at the envelope. She had been an attendant at the Sterling house for nearly 8 years, enough to know how grief smelled on different people, how it sat like a thin coat no one could take off. She had also been there long enough to learn the family's particular vocabulary of omission: unfinished phone calls, elaborately timed visits, and most telling, the gestures not made in public. The envelope was not merely paper, it was a promise, sealed in private, and promises were the memories that liked to reopen. People drifted through rooms like memories, some solid, some translucent. Lawrence Sterling, the eldest son with his cufflinks too bright and a posture kept rehearsed, greeted 2 cousins with the practiced warmth of someone who had learned intimacy as a transaction. Nina Sterling hovered by the sideboard with her phone turned face down, hands trembling as if the device could hold her grief steady. Marcus Sterling leaned against the fireplace, jaw set, in a leather jacket that had once known better days. He carried the sword of resentment that sat quiet and then, in the right wind, lashed out. Vera Caldwell, appointed executor and family friend by necessity and habit, moved through the room like she walked on protocol rather than floorboards. She had the firmness of someone who had been called on to make decisions in tense rooms before. Her voice was the kind that made people listen, because the alternative was to be left talking to walls. Marisol, the housekeeper and longtime aide to Arthur Sterling, hovered not far from the casket. She wore a plain black dress and a face catalogued by Claire's geography. Furrowed brows, softened eyes, a map of miles walked in service, the small kind of loyalty that had nothing to do with money. Marisol's hands found the urn by instinct. She had polished Arthur's shoes every Sunday for 10 years, had straightened his tie in ways no money could buy. She did not belong to the family ledger, and that might be the exact reason her name would be written on more than one page tonight. Claire ran a finger along the rim of the envelope seal, as if testing its temperature, and felt nothing but the careful coolness of prepared mise en place. There were framed photos everywhere, Arthur at various stages, in uniform, on a boat, at a ribbon cutting, at a graduation.
One in particular had been quietly moved closer to the casket, a photograph of Arthur with a young Marisol at a community fundraiser 15 years ago. It was a small, borrowed tenderness in a room that otherwise kept its tenderness catalogued. When the family gathered to speak, less a planned reading and more a ritual held together with habit and shaky breath, Vera took her place at a small lectern. She cleared her throat in a way that implied she had waited for years to do something boringly necessary at precisely the wrong time. "We'll begin with a few words," she said. Her voice was even, the kind of even that also meant she had an agenda catalogued somewhere in a black binder. Claire noticed, as she always did, the way people looked at Vera, not with resentment, but with the complicated gratitude of people who had been given the honor of organizing other people's endings. Lawrence spoke first, because law and lineage often decide who speaks first. He gave a line about his father's work ethic, about how Arthur never rested. He spoke measured phrases that tasted like press releases. There were polite nods, the kind that pretend to understand a lifetime reduced to a paragraph. Marcus muttered something under his breath, something that might have been a compliment, might have been a complaint. Nina's hands clenched so tight around the tissue that it crumpled into a small white mountain. Claire watched, and in watching collected small truths the family left like crumbs, a glance that lasted too long, an elbow pushed, a hand that hesitated before offering comfort. If grief made people honest, money made them forgetful. If grief made them small, money made them large. The initial words dissolved into the low hum of conversation until Vera stood again. "There is a letter from Mr. Sterling," she announced, and there was a rustle not of surprise so much as of expectation. The Sterling family had the curious habit of keeping secrets in plain sight, old letters in the back of drawers, donation records in the attic, but a sealed document placed ceremoniously by the casket was a public thing meant to be private. People straightened, phones shifted out of pockets like cautious dogs. Claire felt a small irrational urge to step between the envelope and the room, to make the paper a talisman and refuse to let it be the reason for a public splitting. She did not, because that was not her job. Her job was to keep the flowers fresh, to usher people into the anteroom when the surge came, to hold the kettle of predictability in boiling moments.
Vera opened the thick cream envelope like it was a seam in a dress she had tailored for an emergency. She unfolded the paper with prudence and began the reading, measured phrases weaving between the old echoes of the house. To my family, Vera read, Arthur's voice already conjured by the cadence of memory. I have done what I believed best. My intentions were never to wound, but to make difficult decisions clear.
She paused, and the room leaned forward, as if tension could be inhaled. I leave my property to be divided amongst my children in equal parts, save for a codicil. At the word, a small collective intake, Claire's throat tightened. A codicil was a hinge. It was where the door opened on decades of assumed truth. It was where the private and public collided. Vera kept reading. This codicil names one beneficiary outside the immediate family. To Marisol Garcia, in recognition of long and faithful service, I leave my primary residence and a sum sufficient for her comfort. Additionally, a legacy is established for a community fund in her name. Silence sat big and heavy. Marisol's hands were suddenly the only hands in the room that didn't tremble. She folded them reflexively in her lap and looked at the floor. For one surreal breath, Claire could see all of the practicalities collapse into that small, face-down photograph, the man who had tutored a neighborhood program, who had loved certain people quietly. Then that breath split like a fault line. Lawrence's jaw tightened first. What did you say? His voice was a low blade, not yet raised, but testing the distance between him and any possible forgiveness. Entitlement has a sound to it, precise, polished, practiced. It had the architecture of a man who had been taught to expect inheritance like punctuation. You can't be serious, Marcus said, more dangerously, the kind of rage that's been simmering for years and finds a match in 5 words. Nina's eyes flashed something like accusation. You gave the house to a... She searched for the right word and trailed off, as if the proper insult would not honor the depth of what she felt. You promised us everything, Lawrence said, and the sentence landed like a claim staked in public air. He promised us everything. He promised us nothing, someone countered, a retired neighbor who had known the family not as shareholders but as people. It was small, true, and terrible, because truth often arrives as the simplest, sharpest thing. Claire felt her chest tightened. She had watched families dissolve over less dramatic things, a misfiled deed, a hidden account, a timed check. But a codicil naming a household servant as primary beneficiary hit a nerve that was more than legal. It was an intimate betrayal of the story they had told themselves about who Arthur Sterling had been. At the whispered mention of the community fund, Nina's face went pale. There were rumors, mortgages, a company that had once failed, medical bills hidden from public view, and her expression read like someone just remembered a debt she had been trying to forget. The house was no longer only a structure. It had become an asset with history, an index of who had been noticed and who had been left to learn the hard parts of adulthood alone. Vera folded the letter back into its envelope, with capitalism's finality.
The decedent's wishes are clear, she said, but the smallness of the phrase did nothing to settle a room that suddenly felt unstitched. You can't do that, Lawrence insisted. You can't just... He tapped the table, as if the wood could be a judge. It was stewardship translated into anger. He owed us. He owes us, he added, as if present tense could retrieve lost time. You knew him, Marisol said softly, surprising Claire with the steadiness in her voice. It struck the room like a small stone. He visited the center when I couldn't get the budget into the mayor's office. He told me the house should become a place for people to meet. Marisol's eyes found the photograph by the casket and did not look away. He promised to be useful in his own way. The room's mood shifted, a low seismic vibration. People were choosing interpretations like sides. Some took slippery lodgings in anger, some in grief. Claire caught herself wanting to say that promises do not have to be bargains, that a life remembered in kindness could be worth more than a ledger entry. It was the kind of remark that would have gotten her sideways looks. She kept silent. The moral clarity of sentiment is rarely persuasive in a room that smells of money. You left us nothing but this? Marcus asked, and the question landed in a way that felt like accusation and confession both. He took a step forward, voice hardening. He left you the house and a little charity, and the rest of us a story. You, he pointed at Marisol, and his finger trembled with something close to enmity. You take what we built. No, Marisol said, but her voice was not loud. She simply looked at him. I did not take, he gave. There is a particular violence in that kind of exchange, because it asks everyone to understand a person beyond the scripts they had been fed. Marisol had been outside the ledger, outside the family's public footprint. And yet, Arthur had been a private man, whose public image had been precisely that, public. People who leave surprise gifts to those who serve them tend to be remembered with both gratitude and suspicion. Someone in the corner, an aunt who had been quiet all night, let out an unexpected laugh. It was sharp, unhinged. Of course he would do something like that, she said. Of course. The phrase sounded like a verdict. Claire felt a chair shift behind her and turned to see that a phone had been raised, its small recorder light blinking like a guillotine. The cameras had discovered itinerary in the motions of grief. The internet was a slow, corrosive witness, and someone's hands were already primed to make the private public. This is the point where a funeral room becomes a stage, where sorrow and spectacle mix. If someone had filmed what was about to happen and posted it, it would get comments, some blaming Marisol, some consoling her, some simply remarking on the timing. People love to watch families tear themselves apart because it affirms their own avoidance.
Claire had watched the pattern before. Outrage, then denial, then an impulse to secure evidence. Social media has a way of making grief a participatory sport. Lawrence closed the distance to the table in 3 strides. He picked up the envelope, as if handling it might transfer authority like a coin. He held it like a relic, and then, without asking, slid his hand over the rim of the casket, fingers near the satin edge, as if to anchor himself to the thing that had been Arthur. Marisol flinched, a reflex that could have been shame, or grief, or 1,000 little injuries catalogued over time. You can't just, Lawrence said again. He was building a public case, point by point. Betrayal, late inheritance, a favor to a servant. He flung the words like spearheads. He dies and gives it to a stranger. She's not a stranger, Marisol said quietly, and there was no flinch this time, only a quiet that felt like a stone settling into a well. I am not a stranger. I lived here, Nina said suddenly, as if borrowing ground from someone else's claim. I took care of him when he needed someone. Her voice cracked at the end, as if the sentence couldn't contain the years inside. You were never here when it counted, Marcus shot back. You were busy. The room hissed. Claire could feel the temperature of air shift. It was the kind of heat that came from too many people telling the truth they had kept small for years. The conversation wasn't about monetary numbers anymore. It was about worth measured in small things. Hospital visits skipped, birthdays forgotten, calls unanswered. Those old scores have a tendency to thicken into shovels. You're not listening, Vera said, trying to reassert order with the dry voice of someone who knows the patience of legalities. This is nine. Words were knives kept sheathed. But intent is a dangerous kind of energy. It travels faster than restraint. In the hush before contact, Claire's world narrowed to 3 images. The envelope on the table, Marisol's hands, and the photograph that had been nudged closer to the casket. It felt like watching an animal ready to lunge. Then someone's elbow knocked into a tray of glasses. Crystal chimed a too bright note. One of the mourners gasped. A phone camera caught the motion and blinked its red eye with the efficiency of a witness who knew their footage would be worth something. The first touch was small, an accusal, a shove that began with impatience and finger-pointing.
They were adults, but memory pushes at bones in ways that make people younger and more dangerous than they intend. Nina reached for the envelope, thinking perhaps to hold it away, to read, to slow the motion. Lawrence grabbed her wrist. The contact was blunt and immediate. Marcus tried to pull Nina away. Words escalated into muffled shouts. Life's little manners were thrown aside. "Don't touch me," Nina snapped, and the plea was edged with desperation. "He's being selfish," Lawrence hissed. "You don't get to—" "It's not yours," Marisol cried suddenly, the sound cutting the room like glass. She made a move toward them, perhaps in defense, perhaps to shield the paper that had been the hedge against a plantation of old grievances.
Her hands were now visible, palms open like a pleading. It should be said, these things rarely begin deliberately. They begin with momentum. A wrist is grabbed, another hand tries to push it away. What would have been a schoolyard tussle in another life now happened in a room with oak panels and a casket, and witnesses who would later call the actions shameful. One of the mourners, an uncle who had been drinking to steady courage, rose to intervene and clipped Lawrence across the shoulder to steady him. That was the exact instant the room's energy chain sped up. Claire moved because she had to, not because she wanted to be the one who intervened. She stepped between them, one hand on Nina's arm, another on Lawrence's sleeve. "Please," she said, a small plea, softer than the word deserved in that moment, because loudness often feeds the furnace. This isn't the way." Her voice was swallowed. People see a uniform, an attendance badge, and assume solutions. Being neutral in the theater of family doesn't come with authority. Claire didn't have the kind of back that carried weight in a room that had been built by men who measured debts and favors. But she had presence, the small credibility of someone who had been present through good and bad. Sometimes presence is more persuasive than rhetoric. "They can't take what's his," Lawrence said, his voice now a growl. He dropped the envelope onto the table with a briskness that signified intent. If he couldn't be the hand that rewrote the will, he would at least show he could control the gesture. He stood like someone who had been cut off at the pass by a thief, performing the grief of loss as if it were evidence of possession. "Please stop," Marisol said again. She tried to bend toward the envelope, as if proximity might be armor. Her hands trembled, not with theft, but with something older, a fear of being exposed to a publicized pity. "You heard what she said," Marcus snapped. He reached out, and in the flurry of movement his palm brushed the edge of the envelope. It slid, tiny as a boat, toward Lawrence. Someone's sleeve flicked, a phone captured it. A child of the family, older and gaunt, shouted something indecipherable.
Voices layered, a collage of accusation and defense, the mourning assembled into spectacle. Claire's heart beat hard. She felt the pull of that old pattern, where public grief turns to public performance. She tried again to interpose. "Everyone take a breath," she said, loud enough to reach past the murmurs. "Please." Bodies pressed. The envelope, so small on its satin stage, became the fulcrum that finally tipped in equilibrium. When hands found each other, forceful and sure and ugly, the room collectively recoiled. It happened quickly after that. When physical contact escalated past pushing and shoving, the house's long-practiced civility folded. Someone called for security, as if reading from an emergency script. People looked for banners to lower for propriety's sake. The phrase "call security" landed in the air like a bell. Claire felt a panicked sympathy for the guards even before they arrived. Their job was to be necessary without spectacle. Reed and Ortega came through the back doorway with the kind of purposeful stride trained in controlled intervention. They were neither cowards nor thugs. They were the kind of men hired to make sure no one got worse than bruised, to make sure the funeral did not become a headline. Their presence in the room did what uniforms always do. It reframed momentum into a possibility of order. "You need to step back," Reed said, in a voice that was concise and careful, the voice of someone who knew the precise measure of force required to interrupt a scene of familial implosion. He did not reach for the envelope, he reached for space. He placed himself between Lawrence and Marcus, palms open, not in peace but in the restraint of someone who understood the physics of pushing a crowd. For a moment, it worked. People took a breath as if the guards had thrown an invisible rope across the room. Phones continued to blink, indifferent witnesses recording punctuation at each beat. A hush returned like a curtain pulled tight across a wound. Claire allowed herself an iota of relief. It felt brittle. Reed's eyes glanced to Marisol, who now stood at the side of the casket like a comet, just barely visible. He nodded once, making contact not as an official but as a human acknowledging the damage proximity had wrought. Ortega moved to the edges, creating a buffer to control trajectories, a quiet choreography of restraint. Lawrence's shoulders heaved, and for a sliver of time Claire thought he might comply, that the spectacle would be damped and the wake would find its way back toward quiet humiliation, the kind that sits with people in the pews until they can leave. But the wound that had been opened was not a simple cut. It was a long, ragged tear that needed more than bandages. "You'll make a statement later," Vera said, her voice a thread trying to stitch the air. She had the binder in her hand like a talisman. "We will resolve this with—" "With what? With paper?" Lawrence interrupted, the scorn flinty and old. "This is happening now." He gestured at the envelope like a man indicating a crime scene. "You're humiliating her," Nina said. It was not calm. Her voice had the tremor of someone teetering on an abyss she didn't know how to climb out of. Eyes fixed on her, on Lawrence, on Marisol. The family's private wounds were now a public performance, and the audience, friends, neighbors, strangers, were not kind. Somewhere in the commotion, Claire realized an image she would not shake. The sealed envelope now lying open on the table, The paper unfolded like a secret breath. Her fingers itched to close it again, to re-roll time into neatness. But paper, once read, refuses to become unread. Reed's hand, pragmatic and sure, moved to physically separate those involved. He took hold of Lawrence's elbow with a grip that was strong but careful. Ortega reached for Marcus at the same time, and the two men were guided, halfway against their will, toward the hallway. The motion was controlled, disproportionate to the violence, but proportionate to the need to reassert order. A shriek went through the room, not the high human scream of a mother in pain, but the brittle sound of something breaking that cannot be mended on the spot. Phones flashed faster now, capturing angles. The social record was being made, even as the human one was being destroyed. That was the new cruelty. The world now archived wounds before they had time to properly ache. Claire held the casket's rail for balance. She watched a guard step between two siblings and felt something old and mournful pass through her, the inevitability of the spectacle. Guards did what they were trained to do, and yet the integrity of the family had already been compromised in a way no uniform could mend. The intervention was necessary, a kind of salvage, but it also announced to the world that something private had become public and brittle. As Reed escorted Lawrence toward the double doors, his hand on the shoulder like a shepherd easing an animal from a cliff, someone in the crowd shouted. The shout was a sharp, sharp flare, and with it, a new layer of shame arrived, the crowd's appetite for story. The name of the house, the family, the living and the dead, everything would now be consumed in the slow churn of gossip. Marisol bent, almost as if to pick up something that had fallen. She gathered the open letter as if it were a fallen child and folded it close to her chest. Her face was a study in the exhaustion of people who have been, their whole lives, the practice of serving. Claire wanted to go to her, to offer some steadying hand, but she found herself corralled by circumstance and presence, and the weight of being a witness. Outside, rain had thickened into a kind of steady percussion. The house had always been good at keeping the world at bay. Tonight, the walls were no match. People moved through the thresholds with faces altered by what they had seen.
The sound of the city, cars, footsteps, the murmuring radio in a taxi, felt like an afterthought to the drama that had been performed beneath chandelier light. Vera stood with the wafer-thin composure of someone who had always functioned in rooms where edges had to be smoothed. She called a soft order for privacy, for space, for necessary steps. Claire could tell she meant it, but did not believe for an instant that private things could ever again be private for the Sterling family. Claire's mind catalogued small things that would remain: the smear of a fingerprint on the envelope, a strand of gray hair caught on a cuff, the pattern of a hand pressed to a mouth. She noticed the look on Reed's face when he had first entered. Professional, yes, but something else underneath: the reluctant sympathy for people who hurt in public. He was a practical man, a keeper of order, and he would probably go home and call his sister to tell her to appreciate small joys. Claire expected Reed to think of his own family later, as all rescuers do. As doors closed and the room thinned, a new quiet took over, different from the one at the beginning. It had not the practiced solemnity of a mourning, but the stunned hush of a place that had been scoured by exposure. People moved like bodies that had been through the motion and were now collecting themselves into something like shame. Claire collected the scattered tissues and set them on a tray. She folded the open letters back into a kind of privacy and placed them on the side table, as if the paper needed shelter. Her hands trembled, not from exertion, but from a calendar of grief that had been reopened and catalogued for public consumption. She had watched families explode before, but the singularity in watching an inheritance become a battleground at a wake had lodged in her like a splinter. Marisol lingered near the casket. Claire moved to her, finally allowed a closeness that had been strained by all of the earlier commotion. "Are you all right?" Claire asked, a question that sounded inadequate. Marisol looked up with a face that had been through storms and now tasted one more. "He always liked to surprise people," she said, the phrase balanced between a laugh and a cry.
I suppose he thought surprises were the last kindness. You didn't ask to be in the middle of this, Claire said. It was the shortest of consolations, but it was real. No, Marisol said. She smoothed the photograph back into position by Arthur's hand, as if setting things right by gesture. But I never asked for much. There are things, Claire knew, that do not resolve easily. Long resentments, the calculus of love, the ledger books of a life. She thought of the sealed envelope, and how such a small thing could be the hinge between worlds. The house would not be the same. The family would not be the same. And this night, if it was filmed, hashtagged and shared, would live in the ether, where nuance seldom survives.
She walked to the doorway and watched the clients leave. Under the rain, cars hissed along the drive, and images of the family would be carried away in phones and headlines. Reed and Ortega, having done what they could, stood by the threshold like 2 sentries, holding the last line between private ruin and public spectacle. The night had not been saved so much as contained. Claire straightened a ribbon on an empty chair and thought of all the ways people measure value, in property, in gratitude, in how one's name is remembered. Arthur Sterling's ledger would now include an unexpected line and a name that did not appear on the balance sheets his children had kept in their heads. The room had kept its secrets and then lost them in public flux. In the quiet that followed the shuffling, Claire found the envelope again. It lay on the table, the paper creased with fingerprints, the seal broken. She reached out to touch it, but paused, conscious of boundaries she had no right to cross. For an instant she wondered which would hurt worse, to be remembered for an inheritance or to be forgotten by the people who had watched you give. She folded her hands in her lap and watched as people drifted into the night. Outside, the rain stitched the world into small reflective filaments. Inside, the house felt like a body that had been cut open. The stitches were temporary, and the scar would remain. Somewhere in her pocket, Claire felt her phone vibrate, an update on a news alert about a family dinner that had turned into a scene. She didn't look. It didn't feel necessary to contemporize the hurt. News outlets could have the spectacle. She would take grief inside out in her own way, slowly, privately. As the last guest filed past the casket, Reed gave Claire a nod that meant practical things. The house was secured, the immediate danger contained, but this evening's events would ripple. Claire returned the nod. She knew the work that would come after, calls to relatives who hadn't been there, a cleanup of both physical and reputational debris, and conversations that would have to happen in more secluded places. Tonight, the house had been served, by a man who had died and by people who had lived in different versions of truth. The sealed envelope, a tiny vessel that had started the night's rupture, now lay where people could see it. Marisol knelt once, as if to bestow a private blessing on the paper and on the man who had written it. Her fingers smoothed its corner and then lifted, the movement like a benediction or the smallest of rebellions. Claire watched her, feeling the weight of witness. Outside, rain softened into something that might be called night. The doors closed and locked, but the sound of voices and the echo of the guard's footsteps remained like a record. For all the appearances of order, Claire knew this fracture would not simply be patched.
The family had been seen in a way they had never intended, and that kind of exposure carves new channels for sorrow. She straightened the photograph by the casket one more time. The image of Arthur looking kindly at Marisol lingered, stubbornly tender, and was a small lighthouse in a house fractured by inheritance and memory. She turned off the lamps one by one, until the room held only the reflective sheen of the casket rails and the hush that follows performance. Then, with the envelope still on the table and the echo of Reed's firm, necessary words in her ears, Claire stepped back into the corridor, where fragments of conversations continued, murmurs about lawyers, about dignity, about the audacity of surprises in the midst of mourning. Her role had been to assist, to steady. Now she would be a witness too, one whose memory would carry the exact sequence of gestures that had been both human and terrible. Outside, the rain began to ease, and somewhere down the driveway a car door clicked shut like a punctuation. The night folded, the family dispersed in pieces, and the house, sterling and storied, sat in the dark with a light still on in the kitchen, where someone would sit through the small hours and think about what they had lost and what they had inherited. End of part 1. Morning came like an apology, gray, even, the rain reduced to a steady insistence against the window panes. The house looked smaller in daylight,
its carved cornices less theatrical, the chandeliers ordinary fixtures instead of drama. Inside, the room smelled of wilted flowers and coffee gone cold. The casket remained, patient and immaculate, a kind of punctuation mark that no one seemed ready to read. Claire moved like someone whose body remembered orders before grief had a chance to rearrange it. There were calls to return, notes to file, a spreadsheet of small practicalities that somehow always lived beneath the thunder of feeling. She checked the urn's placement twice, straightened the photograph by Arthur's elbow, and made a note to speak with Vera about transport for anyone who needed it. Small tasks, folding napkins, authorizing coats, were the scaffolding of normalcy. They also kept people from unraveling. Outside, a black sedan idled where the gravel had been pressed by shoes the night before. A woman in a suit stood nearby, speaking rapidly into a phone. A local reporter had texted a thin promise of restraint and a thicker appetite for grainy footage. The world beyond the hedges was waking up, and, as always, deciding which parts of other people's grief were worth tracing. Claire caught the movement of a news alert on someone's phone as it buzzed on a nearby table. A short, clumsy headline, a cropped video with shaky audio, a handful of comments that judged and forgave with the same impartiality. Even now, the footage from last night was being turned into narrative, binary and loud. The viral thing had a life of its own. It would not respect nuance.
Reed and Ortega returned with quiet, efficient news. They had taken the difficult task of escorting Lawrence and Marcus to the street and then to their cars. Lawrence had been shaken, Marcus quieter than his usual anger, a look of a man who had tasted shame for the first time and found it complex. Vera had issued soft orders, no more open discussions until counsel was present, please, and attempt to insulate the house from further immediate spectacle. Still, someone in the neighborhood had already seen the video and had tagged 2 people and a dozen more fingers in the spread. "Is Marisol leaving with anyone?" Claire asked as Reed passed her a thermos of coffee. "Not yet," he said. His voice carried the professional recognition of someone who had seen similar difficulties. "She wants to stay until the house settles. She's been offered a room at her daughter's. She says she'll think about it." "Does she want help?" Claire asked, meaning more than physical help. There are kinds of solitude that are arrangements of dignity. There are other kinds that are salvations. Reed hesitated, gave a small, private smile. "She said no at first. Then she said maybe. People do that when they're trying to figure out how to be held." Claire nodded. She understood the delicate arithmetic of keeping personal agency intact after a public wrong. "I'll stay until she's ready." While Reed ferried last-minute relatives to the cars, Vera convened a terse meeting in the morning room. She had the binder open, the pages alphabetized. On the coffee table, an unopened note Claire had not noticed the night before sat like a second, smaller secret next to the codicil's papers. Vera's voice when she spoke was low and edged with the kind of exhaustion that she tried to fold into competence. "We need to be clear," Vera said. "There will be calls, possibly an attempt to contest the will. We'll need counsel. We'll need to be deliberate about any public statements. No one else is to handle the papers except me. If anyone asks, direct them to me." Lawrence, who had stayed the latest, perched on the far edge of a tufted sofa and chewed on a fingernail. He had insisted, quietly, with a look that was half command, half pleading, that he be allowed to spend a few minutes alone with the casket before he left. Now, in the bright room, he looked smaller than his cufflinks had suggested. His face held the rawness of someone who had watched his expectations collapsed and realized how many parts of himself were built on those expectations. "I can't believe he'd do that," Nina said from the chair beside him, voice brittle. She had accepted Vera's offer of tea and then refused it, instead winding her hands around the cup as if the porcelain might steady her. He promised us everything." "He didn't," Marcus said, sitting hunched by the bookshelf. His jacket had been shifted to the back of a chair. He looked like a man who had been undressed by truth. "He gave what he chose. It's not theft."
"You think that's comfort," Nina snapped, and for a second the old practiced politeness dissolved. "You think sense makes grief easier?" The argument had the look of a family digging into a map they had no longer been permitted to read. Words that had been stored for years were now in use. Claims that people had forgotten they had were pulled forward and offered as proof of ownership. Late-night hospital runs remembered, birthday calls, a mortgage paid once. The ledger of love is a ledger easy to misread. Claire remained on the edge of the room, a watcher whose job was both to observe and, if necessary, to remove broken glass. She did not take sides. Her loyalty was to the moment's safety, the thing that allowed proper grief. When Marisol stepped in from the hallway, quiet and composed as she always had been, the room took another breath. Marisol had made a decision in the night. She had folded the open codicil, smoothed the edges of the paper, and placed it beside the photograph of Arthur on the side table. Her hands carried the kind of small scars the house had come to know, calluses from long work, a faint ink stain on a knuckle. She spoke with the measured voice of someone who had learned to be careful around both praise and invasion. "I have not wanted to be a spectacle," she said, "and I do not want this house to become battleground for things it was never meant to be. Mr. Sterling wanted what he wanted. That is his right." Lawrence bristled as if the words were salt. Nina's mouth opened and closed. Marcus's jaw worked. There was something about Marisol's composure that made their own chaos more exposed. "He took care of people," Marisol continued, folding her napkin with small movements. "I worked for him because he asked me, not because I wanted ownership. If he thought the house would be better if others could come there, if that was his wish, then I will honor it." "Honor it?" Lawrence's laugh was too sudden, brittle with hurt. "You honor it by taking what should have been ours, what our father promised?" "You assume the promises were made," Marisol said. She looked at them all, nothing performative in the softness of her gaze. "Sometimes men make promises in a way that is clearer to them than to others. He told me once he was sorry he had not been better at showing what was important. He said the house would be better used by the people who needed it." Her words did not extinguish anger, they complicated it. Grief is adept at needing an enemy. If the enemy blurs, the need grows sharper. Claire felt the subtle pull of blame like a tide that cannot be stopped by logic. Yet there was also the quality of an admitted truth in Marisol's face that made her difficult to dismiss. After a while, the argument dissolved again into a cyclical exhaustion. People circled to their familiar accounts. Who had been there? Who had been absent? Who had waved and then vanished?
A lawyer was finally arranged to come by the afternoon. Vera made the call with the thin efficiency of someone closing ranks. There would be forms to sign, advisories, and the slow bureaucracy of untying legal knots. Claire avoided the temptation to give a tidy moral. Law moves in time slower than grief hurts. In the hours that followed, the house emptied at different paces. Some relatives departed with phrases that cradled blame. "He was complicated. We will settle this." Pieces of furniture were wrapped for transport. The hospice arrangements were confirmed. The casket remained, a steady presence, until the last necessary eye had passed. Reed and Ortega stayed in the background, keeping watch like two impartial, competent lines. When evening crept in, the house felt like a body that had been through fever. Claire found herself in the kitchen, alone with a small silver tray. Marisol entered moments later, carrying a thermos and 2 paper cups. She did not appear tired in a theatrical way. There was an evenness to her that had nothing to do with performance. "I should go," she said quietly, arranging the cups across from Claire. "My daughter will worry." "You don't have to go tonight," Claire said. She wanted to offer more than habit allowed. "You can stay. We can get you a room, company." Marisol shook her head with the tiredness of someone who had made countless adjustments. "I will go home. I will visit the center tomorrow. I promised him I would keep helping." She paused, fingers hovering over the rim of the cup. "But She looked down for a moment, then up with a small, private courage. "There was something else. A small note. I found it folded inside the envelope when I tucked it away. It wasn't read aloud." The pause was aperture thin. Claire's hand went to the tray as if the motion could steady anticipation. "What did it say?" Marisol smiled a little, an expression full of residual grief and a strange private sweetness. It was short. "He wrote about something he wished he had done better. He mentioned my name. He wrote that he was grateful." She folded her hands together, and for a moment the room and the whole argument seemed to contract to the size of that folded paper, a private, late gratitude that unsettled the public ledger. The image of Arthur, alone with his thoughts, writing a sentence that would later rearrange lives, was oddly tender. Claire felt an impulse to read it, to bridge the distance between what was done and what it meant. But privacy had a sacredness. Some intimacies are not for the wider world. Marisol, who had held 1,000 small details for others, was allowed her own closure. While these smaller private reconciliations took shape, a different kind of noise had already gathered beyond the hedges.
The viral video, clipped, looped, captioned, had caught attention precisely because it sold a compact circuit of drama, a family tearing in unfamiliar ways, a servant gifted the thing the family expected, and adults reduced to shouting. Comments were cruelly quick, amplifying outrage, pity, and the inevitable memes that twist humanity into caricature. A television news van, sensing the scent of controversy, pulled up across the street in the late afternoon. A lone reporter set up and spoke into a camera with the calm of someone for whom every human tragedy is a commodity. Vera, who was adept enough to accept that a house boundary is porous to phones and a political climate, took measures to preserve what she could. She called counsel, booked the solicitor to come the next morning, and instructed the staff not to release any documents until formalities were observed. "We must assume there will be someone who will try to challenge this," she said flatly. But there was no hunger in her voice for the fight. It was a recognition and a defense. Lawrence, who had retreated to one of the study rooms, emerged in the late afternoon with an air that was not quite contrite and not entirely stormed. He found Claire by the parlor window, looking at the way the light softened on the photograph of Arthur and Marisol. There was a moment's pause where he appeared to consider approaching, and then decided he must. "You're still here," he observed, more as a fact than a question. "I'm finishing the checklists," Claire said. Her voice had that practiced neutrality that had kept her employed through so many tempests. Lawrence's face folded, as if he wanted to be angry, and found the shape softened by late-day fatigue. "I don't know how he could do that," he muttered. It was less an accusation now, and more an existential complaint. "You don't have to understand his reasons to feel wronged," Claire said. She did not attempt to bridge his experience to Marisol's. She simply held the perspective that grief can be both honest and injurious. But if you want to, you could ask. There are ways to make sense without shouting. He looked at her as if surprised by the existence of gentler possibilities. "And what would you get from that?" he asked, not unkindly. "If you asked, you might find a truth that doesn't relieve the hurt, but it might explain it," Claire said. "And sometimes explanation is a softening agent. It doesn't fix everything, but it prevents the wound from reshaping your life entirely." Lawrence stared at the photograph again. Arthur's gaze in the picture was warm and small as lantern light. He seemed to be looking for permission to be howled, to be angry without losing the social code of mourning. The 2 minutes of shared silence circled around the fact that some solutions are practical and slow, while others are immediate and corrosive.
The next morning, the solicitor arrived, a middle-aged woman with an air of legal clarity and the gentle implacability of someone who had seen estate conflicts before. She read the codicil aloud, again, if only to make the words official in a room that had previously allowed them to sting. There would be processes, her voice implied. There would be time. Vera listened, quiet and exact. There was the promise of paperwork and perhaps a more public contest. There would be negotiations, and maybe the inevitable split between the ledger and the life that had made it. But the legal processes, as Claire had learned in the years of her work, would move in slow circles, while the human process moved in quick, jagged turns. People need immediate forms of reconciliation that paperwork cannot supply: a spoken apology, a returned photograph, a hand extended. The law can redistribute property. It cannot mend the small, private architecture of regret. It was a neighbor, a distant cousin who had remained neutral, who shifted the evening towards something quieter and, for Claire, more decisive. The cousin, a widow who had watched the sort of family squabbles that build like blisters over years, stepped into the hallway carrying a small box. She had been silent during the uproar, but now she walked straight to Marisol and handed it to her. "I found this in Arthur's study," she said simply. The box was old, lined with felt, and inside lay a small key on a chain and a sealed envelope, browned at the edges. Marisol's fingers trembled as she lifted the envelope. The small key glinted like a secret. "It's from his desk," the cousin said, sitting back as if a story had been told, not interrupted. "He kept it in the drawer he never opened for anyone." There are moments in which the possibility of private truth makes public drama feel less hungry. Marisol held the envelope like a sacred thing. She slid the flap and unfolded the paper. The handwriting inside, Arthur's, unmistakably, fell into a rhythm of its own. It was short, yes, but enough to rearrange several inner equations. "I wanted to leave something that might matter to the people who were overlooked," Arthur had written. "If I have wronged those I loved, I am sorry. I cannot take back missed dinners or failed promises, but I can give what I can with care. Marisol has been like a daughter to me in ways I never made public. I hope if there is any sense in my last acts, it will do more than satisfy ledgers." The letter did not expiate. It complicated. For Nina, who had been passing the doorway, the words cut like a wedge, and then, in the same motion, made room for a slow unspooling of memory, something she had not allowed herself to feel. She had been the one who cleared bowls and did the errands when she chose, not always when she had been guilty. The letter asked for an empathy that she had not been willing to give in the heat of accusation.
Later that night, long after the solicitor left and the television vans had been rerouted by a late emergency call, Nina arrived at Marisol's small apartment. Simple, warm, touched by small ornaments, one of which was a photograph of a youth center painted in bright colors. She knocked twice, then went in when Marisol opened the door. The two women stood for a long, awkward moment in which neither knew whether a hug would be appropriate or a word, or silence. "I read the letter," Nina said finally. Her voice was small, as if fitted to a bowl. She stopped, choosing which shard to present. "I'm sorry. Not for the house, for the ways I wasn't there, for the years when I measured him by what he left instead of by what he did." Marisol's face shifted in ways that were not dramatized. She stepped forward and placed a hand, gentle, deliberate, on Nina's arm. "Grief makes us hungry," she said softly, "and hunger makes us mean. I do not need apologies to live, but if you need one for your own heart, then take it." They did not rebuild an entire life in that doorway. They traded a small, human acknowledgement. Nina handed Marisol a faded family photograph of Arthur that Nina kept in her wallet, the edges smoothed by being carried. It was a small, tangible restitution, almost absurd in its modesty, but it was a gesture that allowed space for better things later. Back at the house, Claire stood at the parlor window, watching as the neighborhood resumed its rhythms. A mail carrier, a dog walker, a jogger with earbuds. The grand stakes of the previous night now lived alongside the prosaic motions of daily life. The veil between spectacle and ordinary continued to flutter. Reed had driven off to his shift. Vera was on a call, arranging for the community fund's paperwork to be prepared, and making sure Marisol's name was spelled correctly in the formal ledger. That small accuracy mattered. The viral footage circulated in clumps, some sympathetic to Marisol, some furious at the perceived betrayal. It would shape social impressions of a family who were already raw and human and complicated. Claire thought of the many people who had watched and judged, and felt no obligation to know the whole story. She thought of the way social judgment flattens complexity into a meme. There was cruelty in that, but there was also the human tendency to derive moral certainty from a few frames of motion. Weeks later, the house was quieter. There would be legal hearing and possible contestations, of course. Vera had anticipated them with the soft gravity of one who knows how disputes stretch time into frayed ropes. Marcus had retreated to a coastal town to drink and think. Lawrence had taken a job in the city that might have been a convenient distance from both obligations and reconciliations. Nina had begun, hesitantly, to visit the center Arthur had helped fund. She had volunteered, awkwardly at first, learning the names of those she had only once glanced at.
Small gestures matter. One afternoon, she stayed to help sort donated coats and came away exhausted in a good way. Marisol became, over the following months, a quiet steward of what Arthur had intended. She formed a board for the community fund, inviting local leaders to speak and making sure the fund honored what Arthur had wanted without allowing it to become weaponized by family politics. She declined offers of payment from the children she felt had been wronged. The house, she said once on the phone, belonged to those in need when the family allowed it. She insisted the fund be transparent and small enough to manage without spectacle. Claire saw all of this from the angles available to an attendant. She ran shipments of furniture, coordinated donation pickups, and sometimes sat at the small table in the kitchen while Marisol signed forms. They spoke of Arthur in ways that were ordinary, anecdotes about his tendency to sing under his breath when he enjoyed a radio program, the way he would give a coat to someone in winter without explanation, the time he had driven lost teenagers home rather than call the police. Arthur's eccentricities became pieces of a whole person, not a saint, not a villain, merely someone whose last decisions reflected private values. There was, for all the cautious progress, no miraculous patch. The siblings did not reconcile into a sitcom picture of dinner and laughter. There were business negotiations, a contested clause that demanded legal scrutiny, and nights when the family's name circulated in commentary sections that had no patience for nuance. But there were also late phone calls, Nina calling Marisol to ask about a program's hours, Lawrence sending a small check anonymously to the fund, and Marcus volunteering once at a coat drive, then leaving with mud on his shoes and a slow, surprised smile. Claire watched these movements like someone cataloging a fragile restoration. People had a tendency to be both stones and bridges. The fight at the wake had been a fissure that showed how easily grief could be weaponized. In its wake had come slow, imperfect repair. The security guards, Reed and Ortega, had done what they could to keep the night from becoming worse, and their presence had protected the fragile potential for later repair. One late evening, months after the storm, Claire found herself back in the stately house, unplugging the last of the guest lights and closing the same parlor window that had framed so much of the tumult. The room had been arranged for a small community meeting about the fund.
chairs pushed into tidy rows, soft lights warmed the walls. Marisol had insisted the family photograph be set near the front where people could see who had inspired the work. As Claire drew the curtains, she noticed the sealed envelope, now carefully preserved in a small wooden box. It had been placed on the mantel by Vera, who had insisted on safeguarding artifacts with a reverence that bordered on ritual.
The envelope's seal was intact, preserved not as currency, but as a memory of rupture and a reminder of the capacity for small kindnesses. She thought about the photograph, Arthur smiling in a way that had been, for him, a private gift. She thought about how one man's last acts had been misread and then slowly, partly understood. She thought about the way families are messy ledgers, full of gaps and invisible reconciliations. Claire left the house with a final glance back. The lights in the parlor glowed like a commitment kept. Not perfect, but attempted. In the driveway, Reed was locking the gate. He nodded without ceremony. It was the sort of steady companionship that does not require grand pronouncements. On her way out, Claire felt the weight of witness settle in a quiet corner of her chest. She had watched a family fracture under the glare of public attention and then try to put themselves back together with tools that were human and not juridical. Apologies that were slow and tentative, charitable work that required elbow grease, meetings that demanded humility. She had learned, again, that grief and greed are not always separate. Sometimes they sit at the same table, and each can look at the other and mistake intent. The sealed envelope remained on the mantel, an emblem of the night that had rearranged lives. It would be opened, documented, argued about. It would also be a private hinge between a dead man's choices in the living's responses. Claire wondered which would feel heavier in the end, the cost of the fight or the weight of the quiet acts that followed. As she walked down the drive, rain began again, soft, insistent, the kind that washes roads rather than erases them. A neighbor closed her blinds and turned off her porch light. The world resumed its ordinary responsibilities. Children doing homework, a kettle boiling somewhere, someone else's grief waiting patient like a telephone message. The fight had left scars, yes, but it had also left the possibility of small, human repair. If this story moved you, if it made you think about the thin margins between love and ownership, share it with someone who might need the reminder. And if you want to see more stories like this one, quiet, complicated, and human, subscribe and stay with us as we follow the ways families survive what they inherit and what they lose.